All right, welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we have conversations with individuals building accessible businesses, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but to provide a platform to amplify their voice and share their ideas towards a more inclusive world. Today, I'm joined by Tiffany Yu. She is the CEO and founder of Diversability, an award-winning social enterprise to elevate disability pride, the founder of the Awesome Foundation Disability Chapter, and the author of the Anti-Ableist Manifesto, Smashing Stereotypes, Forging Change, and Building a disability-inclusive world. Her TED Talk, How to Help Employees with Disabilities Thrive, has over 1 million views. She serves on the LA 28 Olympic and Paralympic Games Working Group and was a co-chair of the World Economic Forum Sustainable Development Impact Summit. At the age of 9, Tiffany became disabled as a result of a car accident that also took the life of her father. Tiffany, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
I had the distinct pleasure of reading your book before the upcoming publication date of October 8th, and we will definitely include a pre-order link in the show notes of the episode, but I just didn't want to bury the lead, and I just wanted to, one, thank you for writing it, and two, give a resounding recommendation for it. I thought it really beautifully articulated a lot of things as a non-disabled ally, some of the guilt and challenges that we face in promoting a more inclusive world. I thought you articulated beautifully without being critical, kind of giving people without disabilities the grace to make mistakes as long as their intentions are pure and they're committed to self-improvement and better understanding of disability. So I just want to thank you, I guess, for putting it in a way that felt non-critical and very supportive. And I hope it's read by people across industries and amongst many individuals. And I'll do my best to promote it like so.
I appreciate that, and I hope you take that transcript of what you just said and post it on as an Amazon review and a Goodreads review. But I think exactly to your point, I think a big part of my work is, and I mentioned this in the intro of the book, is that learning should never be about shame, right? And I think that so much of what well-meaning or well-intentioned allies who want to show up for us, they feel intimidated or they feel like they're going to get something wrong. And so how can we meet people where they are, not shame them to the point of inaction, right? Guilt and shame driving action, so that we can have more people like you and many of your listeners be able to show up for us.
Yeah, because I know it's a quote that's echoed throughout the book, nothing about us without us, where individuals with disabilities and disabled voices should be at the forefront of a lot of these messages that are shared. So sometimes it feels challenging when I'm hired to do a speech to a disability erg, or when I'm hired to speak to a company about the work that I do at my gym. It feels like I'm not always the one that should be doing that. Do you think I should have that, I guess, sensation or perception? Or how else, I guess, do you think I can better amplify or support people with disabilities? And just, I guess, as a preface, I'll probably interchange between person first language and identity first language as we kind of navigate this conversation. But I guess, how do you think I should feel some sort of like imposter syndrome, I guess, when speaking about these topics?
I guess I'll say two things to that. And you know, there is a chapter, I came up with this acronym PAPUSD, but then as I was going back, I was like, no one's going to remember that. But essentially there's a chapter in there that talks about 6 different ways that non-disabled allies can advocate with us, not for us. But I'll just highlight two things that kind of come to mind. And the first is, the reason why we need our non-disabled allies and people like you in the spaces that you're doing presentations is that your message will resonate with people in a different way, and you have access to spaces that we as disabled people might not necessarily have access to, right? So you're serving as that bridge. At the same time, and I believe this was popularized a couple of years ago, I'm a big fan of passing the mic. So as you mentioned, I run this large community called Diversability. The best way I like to think of us is we're like a disability employee resource group that exists outside of a company. And sometimes even I'll get invited to speak on a very specific topic that I don't have the expertise in. And because we have such a large community, I can effectively pass the mic as well. So if you feel like you're not the best person who's equipped, is there a way that you can use your power and privilege to bring someone who does have that lived experience in? Maybe you co-create or tag team together. Or if we are able to swallow our ego and pride a little bit and have more of an abundance mindset, say, you know what, I'm not the best for this. This person over here is the best for that. And I've had a lot of, a lot of my own experiences where people will come to me saying, hey, we want to do a digital accessibility audit. I'm not the best person to do that. And I think I included like six different suggestions in the book of where you can go if you do want to make sure that your digital websites are up to accessibility guidelines. So yeah, the first is just knowing you kind of serve as that bridge, and your message will resonate with people who might not look like me, right? And that's really powerful as well. And then at the same time, you do have this opportunity to say, and you've had a lot of a ton of guests on your podcast so far, of people of a network and a community that you're building that you can tap into to essentially pass the mic.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're writing a short book on how to build an inclusive fitness business, and it basically was the consolidation of all the lessons that I learned from the lived experiences of people with disabilities. So I'm not claiming to be inventing content. I'm just consolidating a lot of things that I've learned. And that's why the podcast has been so powerful. I was having amazing conversations, and at some point it was like, why am I keeping these private when these lessons should be shared with other people as well? So the podcast has been a great platform, but it also is a practice in humility of, I don't have all the answers, but I'm learning alongside my listeners. And that's why having the opportunity to speak to people like you is so invaluable. I'm very grateful for that. I think I try to stay in my lane with my presentations. I mean, I speak to gyms and businesses, and I try to talk about the value proposition of inclusion. That's kind of where my expertise lies, I guess.
Yeah,
so
and I've been on my own fitness journey over the last, I guess this year will mark 27 years since I've become disabled, right? And there is that stat out there that over 80% of disabled people are intimidated by fitness spaces, right? But we all have a body, and wellness and fitness we can adapt. We can figure out ways to be able to be well in these bodies as well.
Yeah, and that's something that I wanted to touch on. What do you think the fitness industry can do better to support people with disabilities? What positive experiences have you had? And maybe if you're comfortable sharing them, what negative experiences have you had?
Yeah, so I gave a TED talk. My first TEDx talk was in 2018, and it was called The Power of Exclusion. And the whole takeaway from that was I acquired my disability at the age of 9. One of my arms is paralyzed. And at the time, there was really no effort was made to figure out ways that I could participate in physical activities. Yet I had to take this mandatory gym class, dress up and show up for it every single day up until I was in high school. And so in that talk, I just talk about how, to me, it wasn't the fact that I had a paralyzed arm that felt debilitating. It was the fact that I had to show up at this space that I didn't want to be at and no one else wanted to be at. So to be totally transparent, I actually counted myself out of physical activity for almost 20 years after I became disabled. And I can even pinpoint, I'm like, in 2016, I went on this trip and I slipped on this, we were hiking in Costa Rica to a waterfall, and I sat on the rock and I watched everyone, go swim up behind the waterfall. And I kept asking everyone around me, like, oh, are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? And it's so fascinating because I did so many, so I'm the youngest of 4. We did swim classes. We had a diving classes. We had a pool at my childhood home. Like, there was so much about water and physical activity before I became disabled. And what's fascinating is I actually don't think I've been back in my pool at my childhood home in the last 27 years, even swimming. So anyway, so I slipped on the rock on this Costa Rica trip. And at that point I said, you know what, I'm just gonna wave my arms the best that I can and try to make my way over to this waterfall. And so if you can imagine, with a waterfall that's coming, the water's coming down a lot, and it's creating a little bit of a current. And I wasn't strong enough to swim through that current. And this is kind of where interdependence comes in. Someone from my group saw me, knew how much I was trying, came up, just gave me a gentle nudge, enough so that I can make my way up and climb up behind the rocks behind the waterfall and get to experience this, this beautiful waterfall from all different angles. And at the beginning of that, I started to get really curious around the ways that I had been counting myself out of physical activity. And I'm sure you know this, but for a lot of people, sports and team sports is a large part of their adolescence. And for me, it was probably my most traumatizing event. So to actually journey back into that as now a 20-something-year-old was pretty fascinating. But I have a couple big wins, and it was fun that as I was writing this book, I was having all of these kind of fitness milestones as well. So I did my first 20-mile bike ride. Well, first I bought a bike, which was a big deal for me, and biking was something I loved doing as a kid. And San Francisco had a really great adaptive biking program that let me try out all these different bikes to see what would work best for me. And then I just finished my first triathlon. But what's actually fascinating about this whole thing is I think I became so ingrained in this narrative, and I think a lot of disabled people do as well, where we look at something and we say, this is not for me. And I recently just came back. So the name of my injury is called a brachial plexus injury. Easiest way to understand it is that one of our arms is paralyzed. And every couple of years, there's a nonprofit that supports people who have brachial plexus injuries, and they host a camp with, we call ourselves the injured adults. We also have the injured kids with their families, and then medical professionals and therapists and people who support us. And it's hosted at a YMCA. And I know I'm sharing a lot, but I want to share this because 2 years ago, and I actually share a lot of stories throughout the book around my experience at this camp for people with brachial plexus injuries. 2 years ago, there were all these activities that you could sign up for that I had never tried before. So you could go rock climbing, you could try archery, there was axe throwing, I'm sure some other activities. And because I knew I was in this supportive environment where everyone else had a paralyzed arm, and I felt like the YMCA wouldn't have offered those activities if they couldn't figure out how to adapt them for us. I got to do all of them. And I shared this story in the book of trying archery for the first time. And one of the things I'm actually noticing from other people of my injury is that we feel really goofy trying things that we're not good at. I noticed that word was used a lot among my peers. And so I remember trying archery for the first time, and you have to pull, hold the bow and pull your arm back really far. And the first couple of times I wasn't pulling the bow back far enough, and my arrow just, went straight into the dirt. But everyone around me, they were patient. They said, try it again. And they actually didn't let me stop trying until my arrow hit the haystack. And I think that when I think back to your question around how do we make these spaces more inclusive, it's how do we get people to understand that there's no one fitness activity, there's no one way to show up in these fitness spaces, right? You have a whole menu of things that you can try. And what's been fascinating is that for the past year, I've been working out with a group of musicians in a music studio. And I actually bring that up because what I find kind of fascinating about it, so you have all the instruments everywhere, the drums, the piano, like bass is hanging up. And then on the side, we have a little weight rack and a bunch of yoga mats. And it kind of reminds me that when you show up in a fitness space, I think all of us kind of maybe might make these assumptions of how we're supposed to look. But if you can show up at a neutral space, and for these musicians, their home is the music studio, bring a yoga mat, bring some weights, and we have a great trainer, John Q, who shows up with us. But what are the ways that we can make it less intimidating, right? Because actually I bring up that stat of that over 80% of disabled people don't feel welcome in fitness spaces. And some of my friends will come back to me to say, well, what percentage of non-disabled people actually feel welcome in those spaces, right? So I think part of it, and I've actually made a lot of this journey of exploring physical activity for myself public because I want to show possibility that, on one arm I can hold a dumbbell, on the other arm I have to wear wrist weights. That's what works for me, right? If maybe you have a paralyzed arm, or one fascinating thing was for me relearning how to ride a bike, and actually you might appreciate this. I bought a weightlifting cuff and I put it on my injured arm, and it makes it so that I can hold the other handlebar with my injured arm. And what was fascinating was after I posted that video, a mom of shared a video with me of her son who has the same injury riding his bike for the first time with two hands, right? So I think part of it is we need more resource sharing and what I call possibility models within the fitness space to show your body doesn't need to look like this. And actually, just this morning, I was like just scrolling through Instagram, and now they'll show you things that aren't people you're following anymore. And I saw this woman who's in a larger body who has run 28 marathons, right? There's no one way that your body needs to look in order to participate in the activity. Just do what feels good for you. And yeah, so part of it, number one, was for me finding a supportive community of people who were all kind of fumbling and being okay, being goofy, doing the thing, but then also knowing and feeling internally and setting these micro goals that like, I'm going to try this 20-mile bike ride. And actually, I did the 20-mile bike ride with another friend that I met through this really great group called Angel City Sports. And he was like, I'm doing the triathlon. So we had our own little small adaptive group of triathletes as well. That made it also less intimidating for me. I mean, now I'm just chasing after these finisher medals. but it was like, oh, okay, I can train with these people, and like swimming is the one of the three that I feel the least comfortable with. And one of my friends was like, my apartment complex has a pool that you can practice out of, and someone gave me an Equinox guest pass, and it was so fun to just like get everyone involved and cheering me on to try to do this thing I never thought I could do. And I want to circle it back. I know I want to circle it back to the camp. At the most recent camp, there was an activity to go zip lining, but it was a very DIY zip line where essentially you had to climb up what looked like a light pole that literally just had spokes out the side. And as I was walking toward my time to go do the zip line, I ran into a friend who her injury is more recent than mine, and she was taking off her harness because she said, I can't climb up that pole. And she has a little bit more functionality in her injured hand than I do. And I said, I'm going to climb up that pole like a koala, and I'm going to be here to not only show you how I'm going to do it, but to cheer you on so that you can do it too. And as she was climbing up, she started getting emotional, and I just saw so much of myself in her, because when I finished my 20-mile bike ride, I cried because I didn't think I could do it. And I know that what she was feeling was she had already done that first pass of giving up before I had arrived. And then because we knew we were going to be there to make sure that she could do it, like she did it, right? And there were two others in our group who had the injury, who didn't think they could make it up the pole either. And we're like, move at your own pace, do it in your own way. It might look goofy, but look, now you're doing the zip line. What's the next thing you want to do?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that came to mind as you were sharing those stories. I think I think a lot of fitness professionals feel like their space has to look a certain way to begin to accommodate people with disabilities. But as you highlighted, you're working out in a music studio, you're making do with what you have. And I think there's also a tendency to assume that exercise has to look one universal way. You're taught it in the textbooks. And obviously, once you get into the real world and when you work with more diverse populations, you realize it doesn't look that way. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Disability is not synonymous with injury. You don't have to be worried that you're going to injure the client more just if they don't move in the way that you expect. And you just kind of mentioned how you were coming up with accommodations and modifications. And that's something that me and my clients do all the time, where we try to figure out solutions working with what we have. And I think they always value that relationship where we're kind of workshopping it together. And that might be one of the best advantages of not having all the answers, is that humility and that out of the box thinking to kind of come up with solutions when problems present themselves. But as you were speaking about the camp, it was one thing that I've thought about a lot over the years. Haven't really arrived on one conclusive answer, but are programs that only support individuals with disabilities inclusive?
That's a really good question. I think that we need space for both. Right? So even if I think about my work at Diversability, we call ourselves a disability-centered community because we are open to disabled and non-disabled people, but it's about 60 to 70% disabled people. And, I do talk about this in the book. I share an example of kind of a prom for people with disabilities, right? And the prom for people with disabilities has gotten a lot of criticism because it essentially further segregates the disability community, that they need to have their own prom. And I was talking to another friend about this, and one of the things she said is we need to figure out what is at the root of the problem, or what's the root issue here that made it so that we have a separate disability only prom, right? And in the example of the prom, and I'll bring this back to the fitness space, in the example of the prom, disabled people aren't feeling included in the in the prom that their own school is hosting, that they feel more comfortable being in a space that is disability only. At the same time, even thinking about my own career trajectory, I wanted to get an internship in finance. That's what I studied in school, and there was a nonprofit that was focused on helping to support ambitious disabled students get internships at some of their corporate partners, and they would host networking events with their corporate partners that were only for disabled candidates. And I'm a left-handed handshaker. I'm a very confident left-handed handshaker now, but 15 years ago, as someone who really wanted an internship, knew that I could do it, it was really intimidating to show up at the networking sessions with the corporate partners that my university was hosting, and know that everyone was shaking with their right hand, and I would show up and be a left-handed handshaker, and there would always be a pause when I would shake with my left hand, or a fumble, because the person trying to shake my hand is like, do I go like this, or do I shake with my left hand, or and in the book we say let the person lead, but it felt really uncomfortable because it changed the tone of the conversation, because there was the first point of impact was something kind of different. So I actually really appreciated the networking sessions that were disability only, because there's a term coined by Mia Mingus called access intimacy, which is, can I show up in a space and not have to ask for permission to show up, or not have it be weird or different or strange or uncomfortable that I'm doing things the way that I know how to do them? So coming back to the fitness spaces, is it inclusive to have disability only fitness spaces? Yes and no, right? At the root of it is that, as you mentioned, a lot of people who own these fitness spaces feel like they have to look a certain way, and even the people who go in them maybe even have certain body types that look a certain way. They're using the machines in a certain way that if we use them differently, are we as the disabled person going to feel uncomfortable that everyone is staring, right? So that's why, coming back to the camp, and the camp was specifically for people who have brachial plexus injuries. And I was talking to this dad, and his son is now 12. I met him when he was 10. And he said, I just love coming to this camp because I know no one's going to look at my son and think that the way that he's doing things is weird, because everyone's doing them the same way. But at the root of the issue is that the perception is the way that we're doing things, right? And I'm a big proponent of do the things at your own pace in your own way. But our society hasn't really created a support system that says that that's okay, right? So for now, if where we need to start is and I call it like a disability centered space, you might hear people call it a disability forward space. If we start from, let's start with a disability centered space where the people who show up know that the way that they're going to use these machines is different, and they feel a level of this access intimacy, not having to ask for permission, that gives them the confidence to then show up in what we call these mixed ability spaces and know, like, I don't need to look at anyone else looking at me, I'm just doing my own thing, right? But part of it is this external, like, that's why I mentioned it in the book is like sometimes it's not the disability diagnosis in itself, it's the societal reaction to us that makes it so that we are experiencing 5 times more mentally unwell days than our peers, just existing in a society where like I don't know, like the way that I try to, I don't even know what example I was thinking of. But the way that I ride a bike is different, right? I'm wearing my splint, I have my weightlifting cuff. People look because they're curious.
We are grateful for the support of our first show sponsor. Resolution Fitness offers leading brand health club equipment and accessories for residential and commercial use. In addition to traditional exercise equipment, they specialize in adaptive fitness products and wheelchair accessible machines. If you're interested in outfitting your fitness facility or home gym to be more accessible, visit www.resolutionfitness.ca or the link in the show notes below. Yeah, I ask that not to be critical of any other models, but just to kind of reflect on my own and make sure that when I'm saying that I'm trying to create an inclusive fitness center, that I'm receptive to what inclusion is to people of all abilities. I don't really get to define what inclusion means to you, but I can listen to how you want to be included and then try to be proactive in terms of how I set up the environment. So kind of where I've landed at the moment is just making sure that we create options for people to choose what environment with who and how they want to participate in our program. So we still have a few sessions throughout our week that are labeled as like our adaptive group sessions, but just because you have a disability, you don't have to go to that. You can train at any of the other available times in our schedule in the same way that your peers would be able to. So I think but you also mentioned like the cultural piece, I guess, of it. Like I started my gym 8 years ago for my Special Olympic athletes to train alongside their peers. So it's been a part of that ethos since we started. And I think all of our members recognize that when they enter that space, they're entering a space that is disability inclusive, and they need to be aware of that and understanding of that. And I think it's been a really good vehicle of educating. I know in your Georgetown TED Talk, you mentioned a neuropsychologist who said that like shared interest and shared recreation is one of the best ways to address bias and stigma. And I've kind of always said that I think one of the best ways to normalize disability is to create an environment where people with and without disabilities are coexisting and completing similar things, albeit in their own way. So that's why I think I'm really passionate about helping gyms become more inclusive, because I think it doesn't only benefit the individuals with disabilities, but it benefits like people like me whose lives were drastically changed when I was first introduced to disability. So yeah, I think that's, I guess, why I advocate for more inclusive and accessible gyms.
Yeah, well, I recently just celebrated at the music studio we call ourselves the Tiny Room Fit Crew. I recently just celebrated 1 year of consistently going and showing up, and I was reflecting on what that turning point was for me. And I think part of it was that the group was small enough that I could talk to the trainer to say, hey, when you do, I don't know what they call it when you're kind of in tabletop and doing like leg exercises. When you're doing glute exercises, like I don't have the ability to I have the ability to put my injured arm down, but not my non-injured arm. And he said, oh, well, we have this step thing. Let's see if we can put it up high enough so that you can rest on your elbow on your injured arm. So essentially kind of what you're saying, Brendan, is you are co-creating and working with someone. And essentially, I think what comes up for me is the question of where do I fit? No matter who you are, when you walk into a space, I maybe just for me, I'll just talk for myself. I will walk into a space and I'll look around and I know that something in my own internal dialogue is saying, where do I fit? Maybe I look for a friend that I know, a familiar face, maybe someone who has a shared demographic as I do. And that's where I start to build, right? One person at a time. And so if I'm showing up, and this has happened before, where I'm showing up to, I don't know, I tried hot yoga for the first time, and I'm the only one who's doing things differently. I've now come to a place in my life where I feel comfortable enough. I make sure I let them know ahead of time that I'm coming. And then I make sure that I talk to the instructor before and I tell her or him that I'm going to do that, like one of my arms is paralyzed, I'm going to do things in my own way. And she or he will also know if I need to, I can work with that instructor to to figure out different poses that work for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess when you enter a space, we can talk about language and etiquette a bit. What would you like a trainer to ask you about your disability?
That's a good question. So as you've noticed, like I go in and I say, hey, my arm is paralyzed, so I'm going to adapt the things. But I also share that like we don't need to tell anyone what our diagnosis is, right? So again, I would focus on the barrier. So in the case with me and Tiny Room Fit Crew and wanting to do the leg exercises, the barrier is I'm not able to put weight on both of my hands, right? So I think in terms of the fitness space, and then even, you know, one of the things I'm actually really proud of is one of the things that I noticed before I started working out regularly was when people would find out my injury, they wouldn't even think to include it in any fitness activities. And you can also go online and search hashtag brachial plexus injury. You'll come across like some weightlifting and CrossFit, adaptive CrossFit people, but they're not using their injured arm at all. And I didn't want to have that much imbalance. So I knew I can hold a dumbbell or I can hold a weight on my injured arm. How do I hold a weight on my non-injured arm? How do I hold a weight on my injured arm? And so I started with these 1 pound wrist weights, or most people use them as ankle weights, but I was using them as wrist weights. And now I can do 7 pounds on my injured arm, right? But up until that point, no one had worked with me to help me adapt being able to lift weight on my injured arm because I don't have grip, right? So in this case, and this is very specific to me, if I showed up in the space, my hope would be that the trainer is focused on holistic wellness. Because essentially for me, working out is like an extension of physical therapy, which I'm going to have to do this is a lifelong injury. But working with me to say, okay, you have a whole body. Let's figure out what adaptations will work for you so that even if it's not 15 pounds on your injured arm, which is what I do on my non-injured arm, we can at least start to build some weight training on the arm, right? So in that case, that was the barrier, was I can't hold a weight, right? There are so many, and this is what's so cool. You could even get, and I've actually started to experiment with wearing that weightlifting cuff that I use for biking for actually putting a 10-pound weight in there. So I would say we as the disabled people, we know our bodies best, but we're also working to unlearn so much internalized, we can call it internalized ableism, but so much of this is not for me. Because the number of people that I met at the camp who started climbing on the climbing wall and, you know, the first time their arm slipped off a rock, they said, I'm done. But we didn't let them stop there, right? So I'm sure you know this, and I don't think I'm going to phrase it correctly. There's a difference between pain and hurt. And so you want to like, and I actually don't know. I have to like go back to John Q and ask him what the difference is. But like, you want to push. It's going to be hard, right? You don't want to further injure yourself. But in order to make progress, you're going to have to do that hard thing. And sometimes, at least for the rock climbing, for the weights, it was let's start with 1. Now let's try 2. Now I'm up to 7. For the rock climbing, it's like, oh, you slipped. Take a break. Grab back onto the rock. Try to grab one more rock. You know, for the zip line, one more step, you know. And I think if we can take the enormity and intimidation out and say, let's just start with where you are, and then let's start to build from there.
Yeah, there's always ways to modify things, and we have these things called active hands gripping. They're a company that makes these grips, and a lot of our athletes with unilateral differences will use, like you said, these attachments that help them hold weights. And one thing I've also found that's been kind of interesting with our adolescents who have limb difference, sometimes they don't want to use those modifications because it almost to a degree like ostracizes them or draws attention to them. So we just have to be aware of like what that dynamic's like if they're in a room with all their peers that don't have a disability and they just want to not draw any attention to their disability or to their hand or their limb. We have to respect that and find other ways to give them the opportunity to work out. So there's even an assignment in the course that we teach where we ask trainers to come up with these unilateral modifications for all the exercises and try out some different movements if they only have access to one hand. I guess that's one interesting question. Like, do you think disability simulation like that? I've read mixed reviews about disability simulation as making it seem like it's a transient thing or like a temporary thing. Do you think, I guess, where's the line between educational and maybe offensive?
Yeah, I think in general, I am not the biggest fan of the simulation, but if you are a trainer working with your, and the person you're working with has a limb difference or they're blind or they need some other adaptation, I think for me where the simulation comes into play is thinking what the intent is. So if the intent is, let me try to figure out different ways that I can get this person to figure out some accommodation or some access for this person to participate in this activity, right? And then have a menu of different things that you can try, right? So for me, sometimes some wrist weights are too big that even on the smallest, they'll slide off my hand, right? But someone can't really simulate that. And so it's working. And so in this case with a personal trainer, it's trying the thing out and then giving it to the person who does have the lived experience to see what types of additional modifications you can make. But what I will share is that the issue with the simulation exercises is that for those of us who acquire our disabilities, I talk a lot about disability grief. Even people who have disabilities that they're born with, have changes in their body over time. The thing with the simulation is that I like to tell people the last two stages of grief are acceptance and meaning. In a simulation, you only get the acuteness of the loss, right? And that is not where most of us who have disabilities are living. And grief comes in waves, and we can talk about how it's nonlinear and all the different stages. But the issue for me with the simulation is that you only feel the acute grief, the hardest part of the grief. And then you say, oh, this is so hard, right? And I have an example in the book where I talk about the microaggression, I can't imagine. And I have a lot of people who tell me, oh, I can't imagine having to relearn how to write with my non-dominant hand, which is something I had to do. And what I tell them is that if your arm became paralyzed, you would probably figure it out and you would learn how to adapt, right? But underneath that phrase, I can't imagine, is I'm glad I'm not you. And I bring that up because in the simulation exercises, if your takeaway is, wow, that was so hard, I'm glad I don't have this, then that's not what we wanted people to learn, right? But if we're doing it because we're like, oh, I want to try this, I want to try out this wrist weight because I'm working with a client who has a limb difference, then that's a little bit different. You want to feel how it feels on your body, then you come back, you talk to your client, then you get their actual insight into how it feels on their body and work from there.
Yeah, to me, it's always just like, I'm just trying to communicate to the individual that I'm thinking about ways to better support them and that I'm trying to make sure things are safe and comfortable before I ask them to do what I'm asking of them. There's so many different things I want to ask you, but you mentioned the microaggressions and some of the language. I want to make sure we touch on some of the content within the book. I know we've been referencing it throughout the conversation, but maybe for people who aren't familiar with it, I might have a tendency to gloss over things because it's what I read about, but it's like a confirmation bias or like an echo chamber for me, and I want to make sure I don't gloss over things. So your book, The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, what is ableism to you? There you go. Got my copy here too.
We just held up our copies. So ableism to me, and there's a chapter titled What is Ableism that goes into a lot of different definitions. But the definition that I use is when we devalue someone. So ableism is a system of oppression when we devalue someone based on the way their body and or mind works. Ableism is when we devalue someone based on the way their body and or mind works. So I even think about the example where you're saying you have someone with a disability who's in what I would call an integrated fitness class, and they don't want to draw attention to themselves, right? Because they think that by drawing attention to themselves, it devalues their body. And I don't know, I feel like that journey kind of comes over time. I know the way that I do things is going to look different because I can only use one arm. And it's not only the visible of the hand looking different. There are a lot of people who have my injury whose hands don't look any different from their other hand. It's all the stuff that's going on internally. But yeah, ableism can be very overt, by where it could be, oh, if you have a certain type of disability, you're not welcome to this fitness class. Or it can be really subtle and casual, where it's like, oh, this class is open to everyone, but then you have someone show up who has a certain type of disability, and having the instructor tell you, oh, this probably isn't going to work for you, or making that assumption outright, which is, and even beneath that remark, there's a level of care, or like people would tell me like, oh, why are you going biking? That's too dangerous. And then I like go online and I search these like one-handed mountain bikers, road bikers, like going all over the place. And if I really did feel like it was dangerous, I could get a seated trike. There are also adaptive bikes. There are all these things. And again, I think about, to me, access and accommodations are really about how can I participate in that activity, showing up to your class in the same way. I might need some additional modifications, but it means that I can still show up and participate in your class.
Yeah, you mentioned that, like, claiming to be inclusive, but then not being willing to make the necessary accommodations and modifications as a microaggression. What are some other common microaggressions within the disability space that you've encountered?
Yeah, I guess I'll share. I guess I'll share three. There are a lot. So one is, oh well, you're like not really disabled, or like you don't look disabled. Right? Again, it's thinking that disability and success are mutually exclusive, thinking that there's a certain look for disability when about 70 to 80% of disabilities are not apparent. These include things like ADHD, dyslexia, diabetes, substance use disorders, like so many things. And what's so fascinating is I'm actually seeing a lot more friends share that they have ADHD, and other people will call it like executive functioning disorder, but don't identify as disabled, right? And then you think, well, what negative value judgment are we putting on this word disability that makes it so that we don't want to categorize ADHD as a disability? So anyway, so that's the first is, I don't see you as disabled, or I don't think of this as a disability, kind of like erasing or diminishing it. The second is, I'll come back to that 2018 TEDx talk, is the chronic exclusion. So it's saying, oh, we didn't even think that you would want to be in this class, this fitness class. Or like, oh, I didn't even realize that someone who can only use one arm would want to ride a bicycle, right? Sometimes it's not even the things you say, it's the fact that we're forgotten, that people don't even think like, oh, we might show up here. And I have an example, and I'm still on my own journey, but one thing I want to try is pottery. And I had a group of friends. They were going to do a pottery class, and I reached out to my friend organizing it. I said, hey, do you know if the pottery studio can accommodate someone who can only use one hand? They said, oh, I don't know. Maybe we can ask them. And I reached out to the pottery studio, never heard back from them, so decided that I wasn't going to go. So not only did I not get to go hang out with my friends, no one, and no blame to anyone, but I have to ask for permission. I want to make sure that if I am going to show up at a space, they know that I'm coming. And I did have one experience where I went to a conference, and in the morning they had some activities. And one of them was that you could go biking around the city. And I let them know, hey, one of my arms is paralyzed. I'm going to need the back wheel brake to be on the left side, and bike to be in a gear that means that I don't have to change it a lot. And I'm also 5 feet tall, so a smaller bike. And when I showed up and checked in, I felt the anxiety, but then they said, oh, we've been waiting for you. Your bike's ready. And they brought out my bike. So anyway, so the second is kind of like the chronic exclusion. And then the third, I guess I'll say, is kind of like the infantilization of us as disabled adults. So telling us that we're really inspiring for we're going to the grocery store or checking the mail or simply just existing. And sometimes, and actually I'm encountering this right now, I even think about the imagery we use when we want to include a disabled person. And sometimes you can even go online and look, but like if you don't include a person's face and you only include their wheelchair or their prosthetic, that's also a microaggression. To say, oh, we don't even think your face is that important. It's just let's show this like cool looking mobility device or prosthetic or thing like that. And I'm in the process right now of putting together a presentation. And so now my team had included some of that disability imagery of like a cool like robotic arm looking thing or like a really bright colored wheelchair. And I'm just like, where's the person? Where's their face, right? Which also ties into kind of the way that we cover disability stories in the media, right? Does the person with cerebral palsy who ran the marathon, what's their name? How old are they? You know, when we're just like, kid with cerebral palsy inspires, overcomes disability. And I'm just like, well, that person still has cerebral palsy and they have a name and they have probably a whole bunch of things that they are doing. And even in the context of the article, if the reason why we're thinking that is such a feat is because marathons aren't that inclusive, can we make sure to mention that too? Is the way that we cover stories, making sure that we're covering everything.
That infantilization one that was definitely a little bit of a, I shouldn't say confirmation bias, but when I was reading your book, I was like, oh yeah, that echoes one of the feelings that I've had where every couple months something pops up on my news feed about a gym owner who offers free memberships for anyone with a disability, and everyone in the comments section is praising him for how great he is. No one's ever acknowledging the people with disabilities and how hard they're working, but he really is very exaggerated, I guess, with how he communicates with these adults with disabilities and speaking to them as if they're lesser or younger. And I don't know if I'm just a curmudgeon or whether I have some sort of knowledge, but it's always like bothered me. And it's this like push and pull between he's doing a great thing by offering a program for people with disabilities. I do have some issues, I guess, with the everything for people with disabilities should be free thing, but that's probably another whole conversation we could have. But like, is the narrative, I guess, are there ways that inclusion narratives can be harmful for disability inclusion as a whole? And I know we only have a few more minutes, so I know we have to wrap it up in a couple, but
I know.
Yeah.
We'll save it for the part two. But I would say yes and. So I come back to the example of the prom. And I remember one of my friends actually has volunteered for the disability prom for a couple years. And I went to her, with my advocacy hat on. I said, this is harmful to our community to have a segregated prom. She goes, Tiffany, have you met any of the young adults, the disabled people who are attending the prom? Because they had the best time of their lives. And I said, who am I to diminish someone having a transformative experience to feel that access intimacy at a prom and not feel like not similar to your fitness class, like not wanting to draw attention to themselves. Like at the disability prom, they had a great time. Maybe I wouldn't go, and that's okay, right? So I kind of look at the broader picture. So yes, I can understand why the membership would be free, because it not only costs us more to live as disabled people, many of us make less. At the same time, we think about the root of the issue, right? Which is, why does it cost us more to live? And I know you brought up active hands. When I was looking to buy my weightlifting cuff, I actually did look at active hands, and the cost for me to buy it on Amazon versus, and I don't know if we name that company, that big A company, or active hands. And I want to support a disability owned company, but the price differential was well over 10 times, I want to say. Which also raises the question of, hey, if I want to buy something that is going to assist me in lifting weights, why does it cost 10 times more? You could argue smaller audience, blah, blah, blah. And, and I wrote about this in the book, the audience for people who have upper extremity disabilities is 21 million, which is on par with the entire population of Taiwan, which is where my dad is from. And so that seems like a big audience for me. So are some inclusion programs harmful? Depends. But if people are still showing up and partaking in it and having transformative experiences, I'm not going to diminish that. Sometimes I like to joke that I feel like I'm like the Switzerland in the disability community. Is that like, if you're having the best time of your life and this is what needed to happen for you to get an introduction to a fitness space, then why am I here going to criticize that, right? So I guess I'll come back. I guess I'll close by saying the whole reason I wrote this book is I want to create, it sounds like the programs you run, this other person runs, they're changing people's lives. They're giving them an introduction to something they never thought they could do, right? And if ultimately we can help build this disability inclusive world together, and it starts with a free membership. But maybe with a free membership, because even me in like preparing for the triathlon, I was like, woo, I just bought all of this gear. I even had to buy a whole bicycle, But it becomes this introduction to other things, right? And I like to believe it's a whole ecosystem kind of working together. So just because he's offering the free memberships, that's not the only thing, right, that a person can do. There be sliding scale options, right? And then once I start to feel more comfortable, or I'm in a place where I feel more financially stable or more financially secure, I'm going to reinvest it back into the community so that I can enable other people to have these experiences too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we're out of time. I did want to just mention that we'll include a pre-order link for the book. And then, I don't know, I didn't ask you beforehand, but you have the Awesome Foundation Disability chapter. Are you looking for trustees? Would you like us to include that in the show notes as well?
Oh, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I can explain a little bit about it in the show notes, but if you have a minute, but I don't want to go over.
Sure. I'll just mention it very briefly. I will say the Awesome Foundation Disability chapter is something that I do that I never get to talk about. And it's actually making such a huge impact. We award $1,000 microgrants monthly to disability projects. I will say all of our trustees identify as disabled, and we each contribute $100 every single month. We kind of like a giving circle. It is tax deductible now because we have a fiscal sponsor. We started this, Alice Wong and I started this in April of 2017. We haven't even missed a month. We've unfortunately had, anyway, I don't need to bring up that part, but we've awarded over almost 90 grants to different disability projects across 13 countries. And we're only open, so I guess it's twofold. So one is we're always looking for trustees, and these are people who do have the means to contribute $100 every month, and you get to vote on that month's grant. And at the same time, if you are a disabled person, or maybe you're someone listening who serves disabled people and you think that your project is awesome and could use $1,000, if you think $1,000 would be really transformational for your project, like check it out. And we're only open for 10 days every single month. And we get like 60 to 100 submissions. That goes to show, like, I want to see more philanthropic dollars awarded to disability advocacy. Right now, it's only 2% globally. So literally every single space, Brendan, and you touched on a lot of the different spaces that you're in, could use a more disability-centered approach, could use more time and energy toward catering toward disabled customers, because you'll make things better for everyone too.
Absolutely. Well, Tiffany, thank you for your time. I am going to strongly advocate for our audience and people to read this book. We'll give away a couple copies to people that listen to this episode. And again, thank you for your time. This was wonderful.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you for listening to the AdaptX podcast. Our effort to amplify the ideas of our guests and create more inclusive and accessible industries is futile unless these episodes reach a larger audience. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please leave us a rating or a review on whichever platform you use. And if you would like to learn more about AdaptX, the course that we teach to health and fitness professionals and the projects that our organization is working on, you can subscribe to our newsletter through our website, www.adaptx.org. Until next Monday.